Alright, Maintenance Instruction 1210. Electric Motor Division, General Motors Corporation, LaGrange, Illinois, USA. Rubber draft gears, general. There are three types of rubber draft gears supplied with the EMD locomotives. Three types essential for the same of the different. Only inside of the arrangement draft gear consists of the wedge block with two or more rubber pads. Wedge any shim with the may be necessary to bring with the draft gear to the standard side with the parts of the pill into the assembly, inserted into the yoke of the draft gear assembly are then put in the pocket that has been constructed to the underside of the locomotive of the motor frame. After the carrier irons have been bolted in place, the coupler is attached to the yoke to complete the whole draft gear coupler assembly of the locomotive. Draft gear assemblies only in FT, F2, F3 locomotives as part of the number 8082639 draft gear assembly with the four rubber pads, two on each side of the wedge passenger road switcher locomotives with the draft gear assembly, part 8101279. The draft gear assembly is U with two rubber pads on each side of the wedge switcher locomotives U with two draft gears assembly, part 8080369. Each of the U with two rubber pads, one each side of the wedge, two draft gear assemblies are mounted in tandem yoke. The opening of the yoke near the coupler ends is 1/8 of an inch smaller than the length of the opening at the rear end of the yoke. The recesses in the pocket are both the same side of the draft gear and yoke assembly. They are placed in the pocket end section of the rear draft gear fit closely with the pocket, while the end section of the front draft gear will have 1/8 of an inch clearing of the front pocket. Effective arrangement provided with a two-step compression of the draft gear's locomotive. The pulling of the locomotive begin with the extra traffic effort gear farthest of the coupler transmit the force. No, the other draft gear will receive no force due to the 1/8 of an inch clearing within the pocket as the traffic effort increases. The rubber pads in the rear will compress. When the compressor reaches 1/8 of an inch, yoke comes again with the front draft of the gear with the start of the compressor for the completing with the second stage compression. If the locomotive pushing and the both gears compress simultaneously, but the force of the impact is taken by the front draft gear, preventing any powerful distortion of the yoke. Maintenance frequency of the inspection. Rubber draft gears used with the electric motor division do not require periodic inspection. Maintenance necessary only when indicated by compliance with the ICC Interstate Commerce Commission Bureau of Locomotive Inspection Rule 212, the governing of the operating locomotive power equipment. Visual inspection of the rubber draft gears can variably be misleading. Separation rubber from the steel plates, rubber cracking, breaking it off with a small piece of shredding in the natural condition occurs when the draft gears in heavy service. It's if open upon inspection, rubber found completely loose from the steel plate, it will be necessary to remove the draft gear immediately, unless the locomotive happens to do with the maintenance work at this time. Draft gear may be reached and serve the cushioning capacity still with available. The gear should be changed out. Earliest convention time as steel plates, the rubber had been bonded to the tendency to creep out of the wedge block. Or removing the draft gear from the locomotive, the total slack of the whole draft gear yoke and coupler. Something exceeds 1/2 inch draft gear will have the remove of the corners of the ICC regulation 212F bar coupler and draft gear back as well as far as it will go. The coupler and knuckle must measure the outer face of the knuckle point of the locomotive. The bar coupler draft gear as far as it will go again measure the same point of the locomotive of the outer coupler face. If it exceeds 1/2 inch longer than the first measurement, the draft gear will have to be removed and slack taken off. Not use another locomotive or this proof of the draft gear will be compressed shown with a false slack indication. Imperative of the gear is not compressed in at this time. On the passenger locomotive, the whole retractable gear is removed from the front end of the locomotive, placed on the floor of the draft gear, remove the front of the retractable gear, assemble the draft gear, rear passenger locomotive jack down after the carrier irons and coupler have been removed. Remove the draft gear from the switch for locomotive, the whole locomotive have the raised enough of the disengaged center casting. If no other truck work is done with the time of the block solve with the general box and pedestal, the bar all around or both track of the track springs will remain compressed, lessening with the distance the locomotive will have to be raised. Hinge truck door of the fuel tank, remove the carrier plate. With the coupler still attached to the yoke, extend jacks as placed under the draft gear. Move coupling pin coupler, let jacks down slowly. Keep the draft gear level that comes down out of the pocket. When draft gear clears the pocket, skip out from the under locomotive wherever that can be built on to standard. This procedure is reversed to apply to draft gear. When removing the draft gear from the FT locomotive, the place extend jacks under the draft gear. Remove the coupler with a cast iron. With the carrier irons, lower jacks carefully. Gear should come out of the pocket as it waits on the jacks are lowered. There is no need for raising the locomotive as the draft gear will clear the truck end sills. Draft gear is to be removed from the F2, F3 locomotives. The locomotive is to be raised. The truck or trucks removed completely. Overhead crane is to be used lifting locomotive clear off the truck, setting up on the pedestal. If jacking on the crib, jacking and cribbing is to be used to raise the locomotive, and no truck work is to be done at this time. Block solid under the journal box to have said jacking height. Place extended jacks under the draft gear to remove the coupler and knock keys out of the centering device and roll center of the device forward out of the way. Remove locking keys, carrier iron, jacks, drafting gear down out of the pocket with the draft gear yoke assembly on the floor. Remove the draft gear from the yoke. Figure 1 shows your limited dimensions of the bonding. Check with the rubber pads with the condition plane. Thin scale between the rubber and steel plate with a mark over the top of the plate by going completely around with the rubber pad, measuring every inch, and then connecting these marks with chalk. Pattern of the bonding is drawn out. Drawn out of the steel plate, fairly definite pattern generally occurs in Figure 1. This can be with a guide to determine the pads fit. Further surfaces that should be replayed with the checks applied with all type of the draft gear pads. Never use old and new pads together. Pads with pads that are oil soaked should be replaced even though there is no slack in the gear. The apply with both the natural rubber, the synthetic rubber pads, oil soaked pads will expand, taking up any slack that may exist, but the rubber has lost the resiliency of the gear will be damaged, and it will with its continued use. Remove the cause of the oil cause of oil getting out of the rubber pads. Prevent the reoccurrence. Moisture pads made with natural rubber can be recognized as the corner is cut off at each of the steel plate, choking the yoke for length. Your draft gear, remove the yoke. Check for the opening of the yoke for length. Figures 2, 3, 4 show that this place measure. Alright, so he's measuring from here to there, and then there to there. That's checking the yoke for length. More taken up with the table of 5 figure of the worn limited restored limited shim of the necessary restore yoke with standard figure 5. We don't use shims less than 1/8 of an inch. Thick shims are welded to the front with a coupler end of the yoke. Check with the draft gear pocket underside of the locomotive for length. Illustration showing the place the measurement are taken in the pocket length, and table show the worn restored limited shims not less than 1/8 of an inch thickness are welded to the rear of the surface of the pocket figure 6. Assembling draft gear, plate for the wedge on 2 cradle block with a rubber pad, weld wedge blocks, figure 7. Taking care of the lower edge of the steel plate resting on the shoulder of the bottom of the wedge block, place for the wedge on the rubber pads, figure 8. With the gear, let's assemble to put about 150-pound weight over the top of the wedge, or the man standing on the wedge will do. Measure calipers over the height of the gear. Assembly figure 9. Hold over or assembly tight. Show the 1/8, 3/4, 16th of an inch greater the inside diameter of the yoke. If the older rubber pads are being reapplied, 3/16 and 1/4 inch greater new rubber pads are used. If the gear does not come to the proper height, remove the wedge and rubber pad. Place 1/16 total shim on the wedge block, figure 10, but no more than 3 shims on each side of the steel plate on the rubber pads will no longer rest firmly on the shoulders of the bottom wedge block. It must be remembered that 1/16 of an inch shim on each side of the wedge block will raise the height of the draft gear approximately 1/8 of an inch. Draft gear cannot be brought up to height with 3 1/16 of an inch shims. Remove the shim of the wedge block. Weld 1 3/16 of an inch shim on each side. Wedge and bringing the proper height of the adding 1/16 of an inch shim of the wear block with the proper height of the gear with the obtained with the tack weld shims. The welded block shim should not be used with the next wedge if required with the height with the obtained with the shim and the wedge block. Gear assembly should be removed with the press of figure 11 and 2 preliminary loadings about 50,000 pounds each should be applied properly to seat with the gear compressed gear similarly enough to play with the clamps over the end of the gear to hold the compressed position, and a long bolt is put through the center hole over the wedge block and to hold the clamps in place. With the clamps in place, insert the draft gear yoke opening being with the shift of the wedge block is played with the coupler end of the yoke. Place them in this manner with the wedge block. It will not be continually moved and wearing on the carrier irons. When the locomotive is pulling, it will wear the surface of the pocket has. Alright, so shimming of the yoke. Shimming here of the necessary with electrical weld both sides. And that's part A. Show the arrows. Shim here if necessary. Weld 2 inches A rear, A front. Then show figure and worn and restored limited over the draft gear. Shim A, yoke A, worn limited type. Yoke A, restored limit. Shims width and length radius. And then show the end of the locomotive. Shims for necessary electrical weld A in front, A in rear. Pocketed draft gears. Shim A's electrical welding. If shim is necessary, electrical weld end of locomotive unit. Figure 6 show the pocket worn limit, the pocket restored limit, the shim width and length. Figure 7 show the inserting pads into the wedge. Figure 8 show the inserting the wedge and inserting wedge into wedge block. Measuring overall height of gear assembly of the calipers. Being shimmed, opening with the yoke with a non-shim with the gear assembly might be tight fit with the ends of it into the pocket with a advisable plate with a small nut with a between the wedge block with the front yoke opening. Remove the clamps, nut will hold the gear with a slightly compressed allow the gear into the pocket easily with the nut will fall over the first heavily pull the locomotive makes. After the carrier irons have been replaced with the draft gear is ready for the service, a holder in figure 12 over the draft gear assembly can be made over the EMD drawing 8107525. The holder will facilitate handling. Assemble the clamp draft gear and assemble the gear assembly into the yoke figure 13 and construct with assemble the draft gear. Hangs horizontal gear must be inserted into the yoke very easily, but the one holder will suffice all of the draft gears. But 1.5 inch will have to be cut end of the plate with under the eye of the top of the holder U of the gear. 8082639 for the F2, F3 locomotives. Different clamps bolts will be required for each different type of gear, and shows figure 10 installing the wedge block. Figure 11 is a clamp is a compression wedge into the wedge box. No clamps are necessary with assembling the draft gear assembly. You with the switcher locomotive with the 2 heavy straps long enough to fit over the draft gear. 2 1-inch bolt with a 3-inch thread will do. Mounting straps again with the width of the draft gear. Slim with the tight with the nuts. Arm of the draft gear will enter the opening of the yoke. After assemblies enter the yoke, release strap with either drive of the press over the assemble the proper position of the yoke. And show the figure 12. Show the draft gear lifting fixture. Figure 13. Inserting draft gear into the yoke. Figure 14, inverted view of switcher, inverted view of passenger application shows on the figure 15. And then figure 16, application of the F2, F3 locomotive. And this was your rubber draft gears maintenance instruction 1210.